I'm going to start just with a brief history, because I'm not sure how much people know here. I imagine quite a lot. Then I'll turn to questions of representation and risk, gay pride and homophobia, the social gospel and the turn to moralism, human rights and as it morphs into risk management, the criminalization of HIV, and along the way, we're going to have a band is playing, Nebraska is calling, and the virtue of bananas is being besmirched. So that's the agenda for the next 45 minutes. Okay, between 25 and 40 million people worldwide have already died as a result of opportunistic infections resulting from AIDS. It may therefore seem obscene for me to claim that knowledge about AIDS has always been refracted through images, through symbols, and through other forms of representation. For people living with HIV, dying of AIDS and witnessing it, as well as grieving dissolution and death, suffering is of course complex and embodied. Nevertheless, debates about AIDS have remained relentlessly representational. And this is why I'm going to start this talk by looking at one image. This here, Tom Moran, a 37-year-old physical therapist who grew up in a large Catholic family in the southern suburb of Quincy, just outside of Boston. The photograph was taken by Nicholas Nixon shortly before Moran died on the 8th of February 1988. And it's part of a series he did entitled People with AIDS, tracing the devastating impact of AIDS on the bodies of men and women over several months. Nixon claimed, the photographer claimed, that he sought to humanize the disease, to make it a little bit less something that people see at arm's length, a little bit less something that people see at arm's length. He hoped that his photographs would, in his words, add an extra dimension to the fact of the illness and help people understand that it is just a virus and could hit any of us. So what do you see when you look at this photograph of Tom Moran shortly before he died? Well, Dixon's photographs divided opinions in the 1980s and 90s. In Art Forum, photographer Charles Hagan observed that what is usually lacking in all the media uproar about AIDS is a sense of the victims as something more than cases, anonymous components of statistics. It is precisely their identity as individuals that society denies them. In contrast, Hagan contended that Nixon never treats the AIDS patients he photographs as cases or specimens to be examined dispassionately at a distance. His final photograph of Tom Moran is a close-up, so that in print it appears life-size. Moran looks at the camera and through it at us. This is a human being, not a statistic, not a convenient object for moral judgment. But lots of people who saw this exhibition disagreed. And most importantly, many of those people protesting the photographic depictions in people with AIDS were those who were also witnessing the deaths of friends and lovers, as well as struggling with the emotional and physical consequences of their own HIV diagnosis. The most trenchant, I think, of these complaints was made by Douglas Crimp, an activist in ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, founded in 1987. Now, Crimp was appalled that Nixon was reproducing highly damaging tropes. The photographs not only portrayed people with AIDS as isolated individuals, where were their lovers, friends, families, but also were frightening for many communities. The photographs, he said, showed people ravished, disfigured, debilitated by the syndrome. They are generally alone, are desperate, but resigned to their inevitable deaths. In other words, the photographs lacked political context. In Cripp's words, the photographs could produce a phobic effect, in which the last thing one would ever want to do would be to identify with their subjects. A viewer could see them neither as human nor as possible self-images, but rather as images of abjection and otherness. This was part of what many ACT UP activists saw as the depoliticization of AIDS portraiture. It was a comment echoed by Simon Watney, British AIDS activist and co-founder of Outrage, which campaigned for lesbian and gay rights between 1990 and 2011. Watney was outraged by the fact that photographs such as the ones by Nixon, in his words, abstract the experience of people living with AIDS away from the determining context of the major institutions of healthcare and state. As I quoted Nixon, the photographer, saying earlier, he hoped that his photographs would help people understand that it's just a virus and could hit any one of us. A comment that ignores wide disparities of suffering caused by inequalities, discrimination, and political othering, as I'm going to be arguing later. But first, I'm just going to take a few quick steps back in order to trace the history of knowledge of the virus, which was to kind of define the late 20th century in a similar way to the poliovirus epidemic, which I looked at in an earlier lecture, and I can see that some of you were at that polio lecture. It defines it in the late 20th century, like that poliovirus defined the mid-20th century. The story I'm going to tell, and apologies here, is largely British and American, because those are my areas of expertise, and it would be wrong of me to pretend otherwise. But please remember that there is a global dimension that is very, very, very different to this. Okay, almost exactly 42 years ago, on the 5th of June, 1981, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, registered the appearance of a previously rare form of pneumonia in 5 gay men in Los Angeles. A month later, the CDC's morbidity and mortality report noted that 26 young gay men from New York had presented with Kaposi sarcoma. Before the end of that year, public health experts were warning of an epidemic of the disease among gay men and intravenous drugs users. Although initially labeled gay cancer, then gay-related immune deficiency, GRID, by the summer of 1982, it had been named acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS. In 1983, the human virus HIV was identified, leading Robert Gallo, the virologist who discovered or co-discovered the virus, to predict that a vaccine would be found in just a couple of years. It took another 2 years to invent a test that could identify the virus. An important step, because otherwise the virus remained undetected, or could remain undetected for up to a decade. By 1985, in this quick run-through of this history, by 1985, a panic was underway, with Life magazine running a cover in July of that year announcing that now no one is safe from AIDS. An invidious headline subtly conveying the view that homosexuality was not only a lethal disease, but also contagious. The headline also, of course, implied that there was this distinction between innocent and guilty. The former included children, heterosexuals, and hemophiliacs. The latter, of course, gay men and drug users. The poster boy for distinguishing innocent sufferers was Ryan White, hemophiliac, who acquired HIV through contaminated factor VIII blood treatment, and who died in 1990, just 1 month before his high school graduation. By 1994, AIDS had become the leading cause of death for Americans aged 25 to 44. But certain communities were experiencing higher morbidity and mortality. Although the syndrome is typically represented in terms of white, homosexual male populations, of the 355 cases reported in the medical literature in the year after June 1981, 13 were heterosexual women. Even a decade later, however, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, did not include in their case definition of AIDS the most common illness manifestations in women. That is, invasive cervical cancer and recurrent vaginal yeast infections. Women were also excluded from drug trials. This was despite the fact that by 1990, AIDS was the leading cause of death for African American women. Today, 19% of new HIV infections are among women, 54% of whom are African American. 84% were infected by the virus through heterosexual contact. Although the illness is, even today, still raced white, 42% of new infections reported in 2019 occurred amongst African Americans, who are only 13% of the American population. As we've seen throughout this whole series of lectures, these statistics are, of course, definitely underestimates. Minoritized people's illnesses and deaths often don't count, and so are uncounted. Many poor people can also not afford Medicaid, dying before any diagnosis can actually be made. Now, scientists, in this quick run-through of the actual history, struggled, of course, to find ways to halt infections. The first antiretroviral drug to be approved was AZT, which diminishes the virus's ability to replicate. As a monotherapy, it proved inadequate, since the virus quickly built up resistance and mutated. Decade later, 1996, virologist David Ho announced to a stunned audience at the 11th International AIDS Conference in Vancouver that antiretroviral drugs combined with protease inhibitors would fight off the disease. Almost overnight, HIV-positive people who could afford the drugs became chronic patients, as opposed to people living out what they thought was a death sentence. If diagnosed early, taken regularly, antiretroviral ART medications can be effective. The drugs have very severe side effects, however. Furthermore, people have to take very large quantities of the drugs their entire life. Discontinuing can lead to reactivation. As a result, what you see in the medical literature is a shift of focus in this period. And the focus goes from prevention to adherence. That is, behavioral studies about how to ensure that people with HIV adhere to a strict regime of drug taking. The drugs, of course, are made available in very unequal ways. Regular usage was found to be challenging for people with less stable lives. The new technologies failed to take account of socio-political contexts in which these technologies circulated, including their costs and need for punctuality. They ignored the disproportionate impact of homophobia, drug use, colonialism, discrimination in employment, housing, and healthcare for certain groups. 2012, for example, a meta-analysis published by The Lancet found that HIV-positive Black men who have sex with men, MSM, were 22% in Britain and 60% in the US, less likely than other HIV-positive MSMs to receive combination antiretroviral therapy. So in other words, HIV positive men who have sex with men, MSM, were 22% in Britain and 60% in the US, less likely than other HIV positive MSMs to receive combination antiretroviral therapy. The Lancet researchers themselves concluded that elimination of disparities in HIV infection in Black MSMs cannot be accomplished without addressing structural barriers or differences in HIV clinical care and outcomes. Now, HIV and AIDS came as a shock to populations who had come to believe that infectious epidemics were a thing of the past and that the main public health issues were chronic diseases such as cancer and heart problems, a shock, of course, that's been repeated with the current COVID-19. The epidemic also came immediately after a period of optimism and pride for many gay individuals and communities. Now, no one doubted and doubts that homophobia was prevalent throughout the 1960s and 1970s. But in that period, nevertheless, there were reasons to be at least hopeful. For example, in the US, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed discrimination based on sex, as well as religion, color, and race. 1969, the Stonewall Uprising in Greenwich Village served as a catalyst for gay, lesbian, and queer protest and pride. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, sexual restrictions loosened, the counterculture was exploding, feminism was thriving. Human rights, as well as the rights of the disabled and other minoritized groups, were being championed. Now, medically, too, there was a mood of optimism, including an assumption that antibiotics had minimized the longer-term risks of contracting sexually transmitted infections. AIDS activist Michael Kalin even bragged that in his pre-HIV life, he wore his STDs as red badges of courage in a war against a sex-negative society. It was also made official that homosexuality was no longer a psychiatric disorder. 1973, it was removed from the second edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, although some of you who've been here for other lectures will know that, in fact, it was removed, but it continued to lurk in other diagnostic categories. But anyway, by the mid-1970s, more than half of US states had decriminalized homosexuality in private. In the main cities, vibrant, supporting, and proud communities of LGBTQ people became much more visible. This mood of optimism shattered in the 1980s. The HIV/AIDS epidemic both coincided with and fueled a homophobic backlash. The trend towards increased acceptance of sexual difference was reversed. There were calls for the recriminalization and remedicalization of homosexuality. Homosexuals and queers were blamed for the decline of the nuclear family and the rise of promiscuity. While in 1983, 62% of people polled thought homosexual relations were always to mostly wrong. By 1987, this had been jumped to 74%. Now, the 2000s did see a shift to more acceptance. 2000, the percentage of people who disapproved of homosexuality dropped to 46% and then to 30%, 2010. But by this stage, 2 decades of heightened homophobia had severely hampered medical research and treatment, while serving as a deliberate attack on the dignity of minoritized communities. LGBTQ people had long been denied moral citizenship. The AIDS epidemic set them even further outside the fully human, let alone any entitlement to be regarded as upstanding citizens entitled to full rights. Now, the ascendancy of conservative religious organizations boosted hostile attitudes. Now, I find it really interesting. At the start of the HIV crisis, the Catholic Church had taken a compassionate stand. An emphasis on the social gospel meant a focus on the equality of all people under God, coupled with an urge to tackle the wrongs associated with poverty and discrimination. By the 1980s, however, a more conservative wing of the church had come into power, obsessed less with social issues and more with morality, specifically the universal blessings of heterosexuality and the monogamous family unit. The Catholic Church's powerful stake in healthcare, including hospitals and hospices, meant that their insistence that good morality is good science, that's the phrase used by Cardinal John O'Connor of New York, was especially damaging. In effect, deviants were blamed for their own suffering. Religious organizations routinely claimed that the virus was a moral as much as a medical issue. It was God's punishment for sinful sexual behaviors, claimed evangelical televangelist Jerry Falwell. In a 1986 Gallup poll, 43% of Americans believed that HIV/AIDS were divine punishment for moral decline. For many people living with HIV/AIDS, rejection by their spiritual advisors and communities could be particularly painful. The impact on dying people with AIDS could be devastating. Even those who had abandoned the religious views of their families might be still terrified to be told that their lifestyle was leading them straight into the fires of hell. Now, in the early years of the epidemic, a lack of knowledge about routes of transmission helped foster such hostile responses. Was AIDS passed through the air by breathing? Could it be spread by perspiration? Authorities abruptly shut down gay bathhouses and many gay community centers. If a person's diagnosis became known, they could be fired from their job, refused health insurance, evicted from their homes. Immigrants faced huge stigma and incarceration, especially if Haitian. Restaurants who employed gay waiters noticed a drop in the number of customers. In public facilities, toilet seats became an object of hysteria. Even after, though, it had actually been established that the virus could only be transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids, some medical professionals still refused to treat people they suspected of being HIV positive. Some funeral parlors refused to bury people whom they suspected of dying of AIDS complications. Parents sought respectability over honesty about their loved ones' lives. Obituaries were often coy in recording cause of death, euphemistically noting that a person died after a long fight with cancer. The families of patients disregarded the preferences of their family, the preferences of the patients. They refused to allow partners, lovers, and carers to say goodbye, then claimed ownership of any remaining financial resources, such as property, for example. Politicians, no surprise here, could be particularly punitive in their responses. Some, such as Senator Jesse Helms, argued that infected people should be required to live in segregated housing facilities. 1987, he was successful in proposing a budget amendment banning federal funding for HIV/AIDS initiatives that mention homosexuality. March 1986, William Buckley, conservative editor of the National Review, made the case that everyone detected with AIDS should be tattooed in the upper forearm to protect common needle users and on the buttocks to prevent the victimization of other homosexuals. Pat Buchanan, communications director for President Reagan, contended that AIDS was nature's revenge on gay men. And these were not isolated views. In California, for example, a poll calling for mass quarantines collected nearly 400,000 signatures. 1985, 51% of Americans supported quarantining people with AIDS. 51% supported a law making it a crime for a person with AIDS to have sex with another person. Half approved of ID cards for those who tested positive. 45% supported testing job applicants for AIDS antibodies, and 1 in 7 favored tattooing those with the disease. Violence against gay men in particular soared. Black communities experienced additional prejudices and threats. Racists claimed that black communities were teeming with sexual deviants, drug addicts, prostitutes. High levels of unemployment, homelessness, and incarceration fueled racialized forms of homophobia. High levels of HIV amongst black women confirmed long-standing xenophobic narratives about black women as sexually promiscuous and transmitters of all kinds of sexually transmitted infections. So, in these contexts, misinformation spread widely. This was especially the case when it came to safe sex, and some advice was frankly ludicrous. My favorite. Art Ulin, writing in Safe Sex in a Dangerous World, 1987. He seriously argued that it's, quote, "It's time to stop talking about safe sex. I believe we should be talking about safe partners instead." He then contended that one way to find safe partners is to move to a place where the incidence of AIDS is low. There are 2 states that have reported only 4 cases of AIDS since the disease was discovered, while others are crowded with AIDS patients. In other words, New Yorkers, move to Nebraska. Adverts about the need to use condoms also generated some ridiculous advice. And here's my top favorite of them all. President of the International Banana Association, you wondered how I was going to get bananas into this, didn't you? Wrote a letter of complaint to the president of the Public Broadcasting Service. He complained that the choice of the banana, rather than some other inanimate prop in demonstrating how to put on a condom, constitutes arbitrary and reckless disregard for the unsavory association of bananas that will be drawn by the public and the damage to our industry that will result therefrom. I never thought about bananas in the same way. Anyway, unsurprisingly, conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Was HIV a man-made bioweapon deliberately created and released by US research laboratories or the CIA? Was it part of a plot to kill black people? Some scientists even embraced these conspiracy theories, claiming that governments, multinational corporations, pharmaceutical companies were actually in league. They were refusing to investigate whether HIV was really linked to AIDS. They were lying to people about the toxic nature of antiretrovirals. They were exaggerating the numbers of deaths. Virologist Peter Jonesberg publicly argued that AIDS was not caused by the HIV virus. He offered to inject it into his own veins as proof, channeling, but warned that antiretrovirals were simply a way to channel profits to major pharmaceutical companies. South Africa's president, Mbeki, and members of his cabinet were converts. Mbeki's Minister of Health urged South Africans to spurn the toxic ARV treatments and resort to traditional remedies, including garlic, beetroot, African potatoes, and lemon juice. And this advice actually is estimated to be responsible for the deaths of around 300,000 HIV-infected South Africans. Throughout the globe, AIDS deniers and cultropreneurs, that is, entrepreneurs who disregard science, promote conspiracy theories, and seek to profit from alternative remedies, have resulted in devastating public health consequences. These deadly prejudices were inflamed further in 1987, after Randy Schultz published And the Band Played On. As the first history of the syndrome, he was persuaded by his publishers to sensationalize patient zero, Gaëtan Dukas, a gay French-Canadian flight attendant, as the person who brought AIDS to North America. Dukas was diagnosed with cancer May 1980, died March 1984. His portrayal of Dukas was that of a one-dimensional, diabolical foreigner. For Schultz, Dukas was a psychopathic villain who could have stepped straight out of a Gothic novel. And The Band Played On was one of the most widely read books on HIV/AIDS and became one of the most influential books of the time. This was despite the fact that even the designation patient zero was wrong. It was actually a slip of a pen that transformed the CDC's epidemiologist's O, meaning outside of California, for a zero, meaning patient zero. Furthermore, as historian Richard McKay has shown in Patient Zero and the Making of an AIDS Epidemic, which came out in 2017, seriously recommend this book, nearly everything published about Dukas was inaccurate. Rather than being an irresponsible spreader of death, he was actually charming, personally attractive, proudly out, gay man, much loved by his family and his friends. At the time Dukas was diagnosed, little was known about the way the virus was transmitted. The gay community had very good reason to be wary of the medical establishment and the way they moralized about homosexuality, contributing to homophobic rhetoric and the way they sought to monitor gay communities. Although Dukas assessed what evidence was throughout, he assessed what evidence was available and acted accordingly, even participating in HIV support groups. Gaëtan Dukas, along with a large section of the gay community of the time, believed in the overload theory of the disease, as propagated by New York infectious diseases expert Joseph Sonnabend. This held that the disease was the result of the collapse of the immune system due to multiple partners. If people restricted the number of partners, their immune system would recover. And this was exactly what, quite sensibly, Dukas did. Unfortunately, it was wrong. Nevertheless, Dukas's name is constantly mentioned by people advocating for the criminalization of virus transmission. He is kind of the mythical, malicious criminal blamed for deliberately spreading infection. This made him a very convenient scapegoat for politicians, policymakers, public health officials seeking to introduce laws prosecuting people who failed to disclose their positive status to their partners, or who engage in behaviors that increase risk of transmission. Now, the laws differ, of course, in every jurisdiction, but most actually do not criminalize actual transmission, but potential transmission. That is, the victim in the crime need not have contracted the virus at all. Although most of the laws refer only to sexual intercourse, some include oral sex, spitting, or throwing bodily fluids, all actions where the risk of transmission is low, extremely low. As of 2020, Criminal laws associated with HIV, AIDS, and AIDS have been passed in at least 72 nations, and convictions in these laws can result in a lengthy prison sentence. Canada, just to give you one example, has particularly harsh laws associated with HIV transmission. From 1998, people living with HIV had a legal duty to disclose their viral status to sexual partners if sex posed a significant risk of HIV transmission. 2012, however, a judgment by the Supreme Court significantly broadened this. It ruled that people were required to tell a sexual partner if they had HIV before engaging in sex if there was a realistic possibility of transmission. And what this means is that unless a person has both a low viral load and wears a condom, their partner's consent to sexual intercourse is assumed to be vitiated, leading the way to prosecution for sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault. People can be imprisoned even if they are not infectious and there has been no transmission of HIV. And the evidence shows that more than half of cases in Canada that ended in a conviction, there was no HIV transmission. And of those convicted, 93% received a prison sentence. Now, carceral responses to public health crises, public health governance through criminal law, had been made necessary by the introduction and spread of neoliberal economic policies, resulting in severe reductions in social welfare, including public health. This turn to the carceral state was not, of course, new. Queer communities and other minoritized or deviant groups, such as impoverished unmarried mothers blamed for giving birth to crack babies, have a long history of persecution. As with other forms of health-related criminalization, however, it's counterproductive. By increasing the stigma associated with infection, people are discouraged from disclosing their status, let alone seeking treatment. These forms of discrimination disproportionately affect minoritized communities. A study based in California between 1988 and 2014, Black or Latino made up 2/3 of the people who came into contact with the criminal system based on HIV status alone, although they make up only less than a half of the population. Criminalization has worked alongside another shift in the state's management of HIV/AIDS in Europe. Although there are countrywide differences, a significant turning point was the financial crisis of 2008. Up to that time, European states had operated according to a rights-based model founded on the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Social Charter, both of which asserted a universal right to health. In the UK, positive initiatives included the Syringe Exchange Programme, 1987, food aid programs, psychological support groups. US, a successful example of the universal rights approach, was the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, 1990, which gave people with HIV/AIDS protections in employment and healthcare, as well as cementing their rights not to be discriminated against. After 2008, however, this emphasis on universal rights changed towards risk management, efficiency regimes, ideas about containment and protecting intellectual property rights of pharmaceutical companies came to the fore. As universal or broadly based rights fell out of favor, neoliberal policies emphasized the need to prioritize certain populations, including ensuring that risk was not spread to previously unaffected groups, and assessing politics to ensure that they were economically effective. So in Britain, after 2008, there were sweeping cuts to health and social budgets, including incapacity benefits, psychosocial services, all of which proved particularly harmful for people living with HIV/AIDS. There was also a distinct change in tone amongst researchers. Early years of HIV/AIDS management emphasized individual community needs. The voices of those people affected were heard, and heard quite loudly. However, under the new dispensation, an abstract concept of populations who are at risk dominated, in addition to the financial implications of the disease. So we have a shift in language to economic evaluation of the net benefit, limiting economic burdens, cost-effective strategies, and so on. No surprise here, throughout the period, people are influenced or affected by HIV AIDS resisted the stigmatization and discrimination, quickly mobilizing, keen to understand the disease, prevent transmission, and educate the wider public. Most famous of these activist groups, of course, is ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a grassroots democratic political movement. Founded 1987, it borrowed campaigning tactics from civil rights organizations, feminist groups, anti-militarist groups. Extremely diverse initially in terms of personnel, strategies, tactics. Chief aim was to disrupt business as usual, so sit-ins, die-ins, community artworks, public displays of grief, criticizing pharmaceutical industries who allowed, for example, the profits from essential drugs such as daraprim, which helps prevent pneumonia in people with HIV/AIDS, which skyrocketed. The price skyrocketed 50-fold, from $13.50 to $750 per unit by 2015. They proved particularly effective communicators in things like the quilt, the AIDS Memorial Quilt. Notable victories of AIDS activism include streamlining US Food and Drug Administration's, the FDA's, processes for approving drugs, such as AZT, advocating for clean needle exchange, insisting that HIV-positive women be included in drug trials, providing accurate information to public, working to create adequate social services and disability pensions. ACT UP also championed the rights to sexual pleasure and bodily self-determination. They linked up with WHAM, Women's Health Action and Mobilization, uniting debates about AIDS and abortion, instead of remaining as objects of medical and scientific inquiry. Members of activist communities directly challenged the medicalizing discourses. In 1985, after a test became available for the HIV virus, they argued persuasively against mandatory testing. Lesbians also were very active in the movement because they too were under attack by conservative media and politicians. They understood the struggles of their gay brothers. Lesbian activists were particularly prominent in organizing blood drives, volunteering as buddies, marching in protest movements, and staging public prevention events. Prominent activists include lesbian feminists such as Evelyn Hammonds, who'd been involved with the Combahee River Collective, which we've heard quite a lot of in my series of talks. Linda Valarosa, who in 1987 co-wrote the first article on AIDS in a BME magazine, and Kathy Cohen, author of 1999, The Boundaries of Blackness, and the Black Lesbian and Gay Organization, BAM, Black AIDS Mobilization. Art also played an essential role in resistance strategies of all the activist groups. My favorite, and probably one of the most prominent in this period, was Grand Fury, the artistic wing of ACT UP. One of their billboards was entitled, and I'm sorry about the poor image here, it's entitled "Welcome to America," and the text below, which you can't read, goes, "Welcome to America, the only industrialized country besides South Africa without national health care." The power in the billboard rested in the fact that it was not only addressing HIV/AIDS, but also related issues of homelessness, reproductive rights, poverty, inequalities in healthcare. ACT UP was vocal in resisting the artistic commercialization of AIDS, also staging their own counter-artistic campaigns. Most prominent one was their response to this 1992 appropriation of Theresa Farrah's photograph of David Kirby by the fashion sweater company Benetton. They published the version of the statement, "There's only one pullover this photograph should be used to sell." Another powerful but also controversial artistic response was Let the Record Show, 1987, which was a photo installation and a particularly powerful one. If you want to read more about this, remember a long version of my talk with a lot more detail is on the Gresham website, so you can have a look at that. The reason Reagan, of course, was targeted here was that he refused to even say the words AIDS during the first 6 years of the epidemic. ACT UP was also important in theorizing sex and sexuality. Early activists, of course, drew on the writings of Foucault. According to activist Douglas Crimp, Foucault's The History of Sexuality, quote, had something of the effect that Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization had on political movements during the 1960s. By the 1990s, however, they had the writings of queer theorists. So they drew instead of, well, they continued to draw on Foucault, but they also drew on Judith Butler in Gender Trouble and Eve Sedgwick's Ethnology of the Closet. Such texts, of course, changed worlds well beyond LGBTQ ones. But there were also divisions, responses split, particularly or notably between activists who advocated condom use, monogamy, or celibacy, as opposed to those who believed that such responses were anti-sex or represented internalized homophobia. And you can read about this in the long version of this paper. There was also a lack of agreement over sexual practices which paled alongside conflicts associated with strategy and indeed identity. The story has been told much more eloquently by other historians, so I'm giving you a short version here. But in short, there was a tension between white gay male activists on one side and people of color and women on the other. One side was accused of defending white privilege and conformitism. The other side of political utopianism. ACT UP had operated what they called an inside-outside strategy. In other words, while some parts of the movement worked in direct personal relationship to government or corporate officials, having intimate interactions and creating identifications, other parts of the movement provided backup and pressure through street action, playing the role of outside. But as Sarah Schulman explains, and you can also get the references for this in the paper version, which is online on Gresham's website, as she explains, the problem was that most people in power within the AIDS activist movement were white males, and this determined which AIDS activists had the potential to be inside and which ones would be relegated to outside. Because the leadership of ACT UP was white, educated, and well off, many black activists felt marginalized, either because they lacked the economic power or personal support mechanisms to devote their energies and time to the cause, or because they were deliberately relegated to the margins, to the outside. In the words of Alexander Judash, when ACT UP is remembered, other places, people, and forms of AIDS activism are disremembered. The minority Action Committee, MAC, of ACT UP drew attention to racism within the organization. Led by gay men of color, MAC enlisted the support of Sister Love, the Black Church, the Nation of Islam, and other organizations for people of color to argue that finding a magic bullet, that is, prioritizing drugs into bodies, was less important strategically than transforming cultures of discrimination and inequality. They were upset with the assumption that people of color were drug users and by ACT UP's failure to consult Black and Latino communities. When the white male advocates in the Treatment and Data Committee of ACT UP accused the street activists of setting the movement back by alienating allies in government and in science, they responded with bitter claims that ACT UP sought respectability and assimilation over political transformation. Now, the introduction of medication also changed the dynamic of the movement. The erroneously called post-AIDS world saw a depoliticization, individualization, and commercialization of HIV/AIDS. Power moved away from local communities and support groups and towards state regulation and medical as well as pharmaceutical interventions. When gay lifestyles became more assimilationist, local authorities shifted their attention to drug users. In a especially stringent assessment in 2017, critical sexuality studies scholar Gary Dowsett maintained that gay men were all pilled up and potioned into subjection in a biomedical re-regulation of our sexuality. The gay lifestyle now included adding ART to our shopping list of goods and services, along with moisturizer, protein powder, and dildos. Queer theorist Jasper K. Perra has coined a witty term to refer to this, and that is homonormativity, replicating some of the hierarchical ideas found in heteronormativity in terms of race, class, gender, nation, state. Conclusion. HIV/AIDS remains a major global problem. Today, more than 38 million people are living with HIV. It is yet another example of health as a political as much as a medical issue. But of course, there is no single story of HIV/AIDS. This is why I just want to end in a couple of sentences with Tom Moran, the photographed man with whom I started this talk. Wrong direction. Although I agree with the criticism of Nixon, who took the photographs, I think it's important to note that Tom Moran was keen that the photographs were taken. And Tom Moran was, of course, much more than his photograph. He was secretive. He was abrasive. He was loved by his family. He was a very good friend. He was a man with a cheeky smile. In 1996, Tom Gunn composed a poem in the Circle of Peace at the National AIDS Memorial Grove in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. The only, I think it's still the only, you may correct me, the only federally designated AIDS memorial in the US. And some of the lines go like this, and I'm going to end with these lines. Walker within the circle, pause. Although they all died of one cause, remember how their lives were dense with fine, compacted difference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I'm just going to start with one question here, and then maybe some people in the audience would like to ask some. So we have one here. How do you know the conspiracy theories about the cause of AIDS were wrong? in terms of the disproportionate effect on gay men and the African population?
Yeah, there's really great research done on conspiracy theories more generally. We don't know that some of them are wrong. What we do have is the best evidence, both scientific evidence and experiential evidence that suggests very strongly, certainly medical and scientific evidence, that those conspiracy theories I mentioned here actually are not correct, and they do great harm to people. It's a really big question because, of course, conspiracy theories, the term itself is used just to denigrate any theory that you don't agree with yourself. But I think if we are talking about, and we are talking about illness and a cultural history of illness, we do have to take two things seriously. Firstly, we have to take very seriously the scientific evidence that we have, which is always under revision, and I mean, that's what science is, experimenting and proving and disproving hypotheses, and as we saw here, the scientists did differ at times and revised their views. That's the first thing that we have to take into serious consideration, that we need to pay attention to what the best knowledge that we have is. But I think the second thing we need to take into consideration, which is almost as important, is that conspiracy theories have an impact on people's lives. And we need to take them seriously in the sense that if we are to tackle something like a infectious disease, we also have to take those discounted knowledges very, very seriously in order to persuade people to act in ways that keep them healthy.
Yeah. Great. Right at the back, something in the blue shirt.
Just wondered what you thought of recent movies and TV series. I'm thinking like 120 BPM, the French movie that looked at particularly ACT UP, and something like the Channel 4 series, It's a Sin.
I don't know that German film, so can you come up afterwards and write it down for me? That would be great. I think that in terms of the documentaries that have been made about groups such as ACT UP, I think actually some of them are really interesting and very good. I think that they fail occasionally to, the ones I've seen, are scared or timid when they're kind of pointing out the divisions within the movement, because there is a sense that they did good things. They really changed the world for people who are living with HIV and AIDS and their families, friends, and communities. And therefore, you don't want to, there's a sort of timidity about criticizing them. And I think this is what, I don't think we should be afraid of that, because, by actually looking at the fractures within a movement, we not only learn about what is actually happening at the time, in the context of the time. And here I'm talking particularly 80s and 90s. But we also learn about what we can do in the future in terms of effective activism and where we made mistakes in those earlier years. And I mean, this is not unique, of course, to representations, TV, documentary, whatever representations of any group. We certainly have it. I mean, I remember, we certainly had in the early feminist documentaries about 70s, 80s feminism, very, very similar issues about timidity, about criticizing. But I don't think we should be afraid of that. And I think it's a good thing to talk about. And just one sort of footnote to that, by being timid, you're actually silencing people within those movements. And you're silencing particular people within those movements, within those activist movements. And I think that's something we really need to resist.
The lady at the back.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you once again for a great presentation. There's so many different things to think about here, so I'm really happy that there's a longer version for us to explore. But I was wondering if in your research you'd encountered anything around the subculture of bug chasing around the 80s, and
what?
Bug chasing in terms of the transforming the narrative around the kind of the gloom and the risk and the fear around contracting HIV/AIDS, and how different subcultures try to sort of reclaim some sort of strength or courage from that position? I don't know if you had anything about that in your research.
Yeah, I do. And it's in the long version. It was in the cut version here, which I cut it as I was speaking. I mean, I think that is really important. And one of the things that I do speak about in this talk and the longer version is precisely the divisions between the different approaches about, celebrating sex within the gay community versus celibacy, monogamy, the fear and the anxiety around sex. And that is a huge debate in particularly early 1990s, that some of the people that I showed very quickly, the slides, which I went through really quickly, they were really at the heart of this tension between those two movements. So very much so. It's a really good point and an important one.
Thank you. If no one else has another question, we've reached 7 o'clock, so it's the end of our time, and I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Bourke, for that. Joanna's last lecture is on Thursday, so please come along. Thank you very much.
Thanks.